The first arrow took the man beside Sharamph Stormbound in the throat, and she did not even turn to watch him fall. She had 4 soldiers left between her and the cliff road, and she meant to put every one of them in the dirt before the sun cleared the ridge. Her twin axes were already wet, her leathers were slick with someone else's blood, and the salt wind off the ashen sea was screaming through the gorge loud enough to swallow the sound of her own war cry. Behind her, pressed against the rock face with a broken arm cradled to his chest, her cousin Growled Stormbound bellowed something she could not make out over the clash of steel. She did not need to hear it. She could feel it. 6 of Lord Roderick Vane's soldiers had ridden them down on the coast road 3 miles short of Saltmere, and every one of them wore the black and silver tabard of a usurper who had decided that an orc woman's freedom was his to sell. She was not going back to Ashcombe Keep in chains. She would die on these rocks first, and take as many of them with her as her arms could manage. A soldier lunged for her from the left, sword low, aiming to hamstring her the way a man hunts a wolf rather than fights a woman. She caught the blade on the haft of her axe, twisted, and put her boot into his chest hard enough to send him over the low stone wall and down into the surf 30 feet below. Another came from the right, and she was already turning to meet him when the 4th man, the one she had lost track of in the scramble, put an arrow into her thigh. The pain was a white flash. Her leg buckled. She did not fall, would not fall, but the world tilted sideways for one dangerous heartbeat, and in that heartbeat the swordsman closed the distance. That was when the stranger came out of nowhere with a blacksmith's hammer, and hit the swordsman across the back of the skull, so hard the man's helmet rang like a struck bell. Sharamph had time to register only a few things before the fighting swallowed her attention again. A man, human, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders in the way of someone who worked iron rather than a sword, wearing a scorched leather apron over plain traveling clothes, no armor at all, driving a hammer meant for shaping steel into a soldier's spine, as if he had never once considered that he might die doing it. He had come running down from the cliff path with a mule cart rattling behind him, and he had thrown himself into the middle of a battle that was not his, for a woman he had never met, without a single weapon that had been forged for war. It was the single stupidest thing Sharamph had ever seen a human do. She decided, in the space of one breath, that she would not let him die for it. She drove her axe through the ribs of the man closing on her, spun on her wounded leg with a snarl of pain, and put herself bodily between the stranger and the last soldier's blade just as it came down toward his unprotected head. The sword bit into the leather vambrace on her forearm instead of the stranger's skull, and she felt it cut deep, felt the hot spill of her own blood, and did not care, because the man behind her staggered back with his hammer raised, and his eyes wide and alive rather than glassy and dead on the rocks. She finished the last soldier with her second axe before he could recover his balance. The gorge went quiet except for the wind, the surf, and Growl's ragged breathing against the rock. The stranger lowered his hammer slowly, staring at the arrow still jutting from her thigh, at the blood running down her arm, at the 6 dead men scattered across the coast road, and did not run. That was the second stupidest thing he did that morning, and the thing that made Sharamph Stormbound look at him properly for the first time. "You are either the bravest man in this province," she said, breathing hard, lowering herself carefully to sit on the low stone wall so she would not fall over from the arrow, "or the greatest fool. I have not decided which." "Probably both," the man said. His voice shook only a little. He set the hammer down against the cart, and Sharamph noted with some surprise that his hands were steady when he knelt beside her leg despite everything. "I'm Emmett Morgan. I keep the forge up at the old priory. You're bleeding a great deal, and if you don't let me look at that, you're going to bleed a great deal more. I have survived worse than an arrow smith. I don't doubt it." He glanced at the 6 bodies, then back at her, and something in his face was careful, not frightened. "But you're still going to let me look at it, because I didn't just get my cart run off the road and my nerves half-killed to watch you die of something a good bandage could have stopped." Sharamph Stormbound, who had led war bands, who had buried her father beneath a cairn of stones after Lord Vane's men cut him down for refusing to bow, who had not trusted a human with anything sharper than a dinner knife in 3 long years, found herself laughing despite the pain, despite the blood, despite everything. "Fine," she said. "Do your work, Smith, but be quick about it. Vane will send more men when these do not return, and I would rather be gone from this road before they come." That was how the bargain began, though neither of them knew yet how far it would carry them. Emmett Morgan bound the wound with strips torn from his own shirt, working with the same careful precision he brought to fitting a blade to a hilt, and Sharamph watched his hands the whole time and said nothing, though her mind was already turning over the shape of a plan. By the time Krug had been helped onto the cart, his arm splinted with a wagon spoke and a leather strap, and the mule had been coaxed back onto the road, Sharamph had made her decision. She did not make decisions slowly. It was not in her nature, and 3 years of running from Vane's soldiers had taught her that hesitation killed faster than any blade. "I have a proposal for you, Smith," she said, as the cart rattled up the cliff road toward a squat gray shape perched above the sea that she assumed must be his priory. "You saved my life today foolishly, and I saved yours in return, so we are even on that account, but I find myself in need of something more permanent than a bandage." Emmett kept his eyes on the mule's ears. "I'm listening. Lord Vane wants me returned to Ashcombe Keep. He means to marry me to one of his soldiers, a brute named Bregan Cole, and parade the wedding through every market town on this coast as proof that the orc clans have bent their necks to him. My clan is broken. My father is dead. I have perhaps a dozen kin left who still call themselves Stormbound, scattered in the hills, and if I do not find a way to make myself untouchable to him, he will hunt every one of them down using me as the leash." "That's a hard thing to hear over breakfast," Emmett said. "What does it have to do with me?" "There is an old treaty, the Concord of Stonewater. Perhaps you have heard of it." "I know it. My family's held rights under it for 3 generations. It's the only reason the priory's still standing and not turned into another one of Vane's granaries." Sharamph nodded slowly, satisfied. "Then you already understand more than most humans in this province. Under the Concord, any orc woman who weds a human Concord holder, a man who holds recognized title to land or works under the old treaty seals, cannot be seized or married against her will by any lord, false or true. Vane's claim to Ashcombe Keep is built on forged papers and a dead man's stolen seal. He cannot afford to be seen breaking the Concord openly, not while he is still trying to convince the Crown's magistrates that his rule is lawful." Emmett finally looked at her, and there was a wariness in his face now, though not the kind she had seen in other humans, not disgust or fear, only the plain caution of a man being asked to walk into something larger than himself. "You want to marry me," he said. "I want to make a bargain with you," she corrected. "Marriage in name, protection in truth. I will not pretend to feel more than I do for a man I met an hour ago bleeding on a cliff road. But you hold the priory's forged rights, and that title is enough to put me beyond Vane's reach, so long as the marriage is recorded properly and witnessed. In exchange, I offer you my strength. I am the last war leader the Stormbound clan has left. I can defend that forge of yours better than any lock or wall. I can put down any man who comes to take it, or you from Vane. It is a fair trade, Smith. Better than fair." For a long moment Emmett Morgan said nothing at all, and the cart wheels creaked over the ruts in the road, and the gulls screamed somewhere above the cliffs, and Sharamph found herself watching his face with far more attention than the situation strictly required. "I've lived at that priory alone for 6 years, he said finally, "since my father died and left me the forge and not much else. Folks in Saltmere are polite enough when they want a blade mended, but nobody's exactly lined up to share supper with the smith who lives in a haunted old monastery on the edge of the world. I won't pretend a marriage of convenience is what I pictured for myself, but I also won't pretend I like the idea of you or your cousin dying on a road because I said no to something that costs me nothing but a signature and a room to share. It will cost you more than that, Sharamph said honestly. Vane will not simply let this go. He will come for both of us eventually. I would rather you understand that now than curse me for it later. Emmett almost smiled, though it was a tired, crooked thing. Well, nobody's ever accused me of picking the easy road. Then we have a bargain. We have a bargain, Sharamph Stormbound. She held out her uninjured hand, orc fashion, wrist to wrist rather than palm to palm, and after a heartbeat of confusion he matched the grip, and something passed between them in that touch that neither of them named yet, though both of them felt it. The priory itself, when they finally reached it, sat on a shoulder of black rock jutting out over the ashen sea like a fist raised against the weather. It had been a monastery once, centuries past, before the old wars had swept the monks away and left only stone halls, a bell tower gone silent, and a great vaulted room that some long-dead brother had turned into a forge for reasons lost to history. Emmett had made that forge his own. Sharamph could see, even riding in on a cart with an arrow wound throbbing in her leg, that the man kept his tools with a care that bordered on reverence, that the racks of blades along the workshop walls were oiled and true, that whatever else this smith lacked in company or comfort, he had poured himself entirely into his craft. She was given a room in the old dormitory wing, spare and cold but clean, and Krug was set up beside the kitchen hearth where Emmett could tend his splint. The wedding, such as it was, took place 3 days later in front of the priory's old chapel altar, witnessed by a traveling magistrate Emmett paid handsomely to ride out from Saltmere and by Krug, who scowled through the whole affair but signed his name as witness all the same. Sharamph wore her travel leathers, cinched tight at the waist and laced up the front in dark, oiled hide that had seen 100 hard roads, because she owned no gown and would not have worn one if she had. Emmett wore his good shirt, the one without scorch marks, and looked so uncomfortable in his own collar that Sharamph nearly laughed aloud during the vows. It was not a marriage born of love. Both of them said as much to the magistrate plainly, because neither of them saw the use in lying about it. But it was a bargain honestly struck, sealed properly under the old Concord, and recorded in ink that would hold up in any magistrate's court in the province, and that, for the moment, was enough. Neither of them expected what came after. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned for. Sharamph's leg healed within a week, faster than any humans would have, and she took to the forge yard with restless energy, sparring against posts, running the cliff paths, testing the boundaries of a home that was not truly hers yet but might become so. Emmett kept working his forge, shaping blades for Saltmere's fishermen and farmers, and found, to his quiet surprise, that he no longer worked entirely alone. Sharamph took to standing in the doorway of the workshop some evenings, arms crossed, watching him hammer steel with an attention that unsettled him at first, and then, slowly, began to warm something in his chest he had thought long since gone cold. It was Sharamph who started the game of dares on the 5th night over a shared meal of salted fish and hard bread in the priory's old refectory. "You flinched," she said, nodding at the mug of Clanfear spirits she had poured for herself from a small clay jug she had carried since her clan's last camp, "when Krug offered you a taste this morning. That stuff smells like it could strip paint off a barn door. It can. That is rather the point." She pushed the mug across the table toward him, a challenge glinting in her dark eyes. "I dare you to drink it without making that face humans make, the one like a cat stepping in water." Emmett eyed the mug the way he might eye a blade of uncertain temper. "And if I do, then I will admit you are braver than you look, Smith. That's not much of a prize." "It is more of a prize than you think," Sharamph said, and something in her voice, low and amused, made him pick up the mug anyway. He drank. His eyes watered instantly, his throat burned like he had swallowed a live coal, and he set the mug down with a strangled cough that made Sharamph throw her head back and laugh, a real laugh, loud and unguarded, the first he had heard from her since she arrived. "Terrible," he managed. "Absolutely terrible. You did not make the face. I'm making it now. Too late." The dare is won. She was still grinning, sharp canines catching the firelight, and Emmett thought, not for the first time but for the first time with any real weight, that she was breathtaking when she let her guard slip even that much. The dares became a habit after that, small at first, then bolder. She dared him to spar with her using practice staves in the forge yard, and though he lost every match badly, he kept coming back for more until his ribs were a mottled patchwork of bruises, and Sharamph found herself, against all sense, impressed by his stubbornness rather than his skill. He dared her, in turn, to try her hand at the forge, to hold a blade in progress and feel the heat of the coals against her palms, and she did it without flinching, though the sweat ran freely down her collarbone, and Emmett had to look away rather than watch the firelight move over her skin for longer than was wise. It was 3 weeks after the wedding, on a morning when Saltmere's market square was crowded with traders and fishwives, and a scattering of vain soldiers keeping half-hearted watch over the harbor gate, that the dares turned into something else entirely. "They are watching us," Sharamph murmured, close to his ear, as they walked the market row together to buy nails and rope for the forge. "Vain spies, 2 of them by the fish stall. They do not believe our marriage is real. They think it is a trick to shelter me from the treaty's teeth. Let them think what they like. If they report doubt to Vane, he may test the marriage's legitimacy in a magistrate's court. That would be dangerous for both of us." She turned to face him fully in the middle of the crowded row, and there was a challenge in her eyes that had nothing to do with clanfare spirits or sparring staves. "I dare you to kiss me, Smith. Here, in front of everyone. Convince them there is nothing to doubt." Emmett's mouth went dry. "Sharamph, are you afraid?" "Of you, a little, always." He managed a crooked smile even as his heart pounded like a hammer on hot steel. "But that's not why I'm hesitating." "Then why?" "Because I don't want to do it just to fool a couple of spies by the fish stall," he said quietly, honestly, the words coming out before he could stop them. "If I kiss you, Sharamph Stormbound, I want it to be because I mean it, not because we're playing a part for an audience." Something shifted in her face. Some wall he had not even realized was still standing, coming down by a fraction. "Then mean it," she said, low, rough, and closed the distance between them herself. The kiss was not gentle. It was not the careful, testing thing either of them might have imagined if they had planned it. Sharamph kissed him the way she did everything, with her whole self committed, one hand fisting in the front of his shirt. And Emmett, after one startled heartbeat, kissed her back just as fiercely, forgetting entirely about the spies, the market, the watching crowd, forgetting everything except the heat of her mouth and the fierce, hungry way she held on to him, as though she had been waiting 3 weeks to do exactly this. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the market row had gone remarkably quiet around them, and somewhere behind the fish stall 2 soldiers in black and silver tabards were hurrying away toward the harbor gate with considerably more urgency than they had arrived with. "Well," Emmett said, a little dazed, "I suppose that settles the spies." "It settles nothing," Sharamph said, though her voice had lost its usual sharp edge, gone soft and low in a way that made his pulse race all over again. "It only raises the stakes." And she smiled at him, slow and dangerous and warm all at once, and turned back toward the nail stall as though nothing at all had happened, leaving Emmett standing in the middle of the market row trying to remember how to breathe. That night, back at the Priory, the dare game reached its final escalation, though not in the way either of them expected. Emmett had been sleeping in the forge loft since the wedding, on a narrow cot beside the tool racks, leaving the dormitory room they were meant to share as husband and wife entirely to Sharamph. It had seemed the sensible arrangement for 2 strangers bound by paper rather than affection. But the sensible arrangement had grown steadily less sensible with every dare, every stolen glance, every night Emmett lay awake in the cold loft thinking about the woman sleeping alone 2 floors below. Sharamph found him there after supper, arms crossed in the doorway of the loft, an expression on her face that Emmett was beginning to recognize as trouble. "This is foolish," she said without preamble. "What's foolish?" "You freezing up here among your anvils like a hermit, while I sleep alone in a bed built for two, in a room that is supposedly ours. If vain spies learn of it, they will have all the proof they need that our marriage is a sham." She tilted her head, and there was that dangerous glint again, though softer now, less a challenge and more an invitation. "I dare you to sleep in your own marriage bed tonight, Smith, like a husband and not a coward hiding in his workshop." Emmett's ears went hot. "That's a bold dare." "I have never been accused of timidity." She held his gaze steadily. "Well, do you accept, or do I sleep alone tonight while my husband proves himself a fool for the 4th week running?" He accepted. That was how Emmett Morgan came to be lying in the dark beside Sharamph Stormbound for the first time, both of them carefully, painstakingly aware of the space between them, neither quite brave enough yet to close it, though the air in the room felt thick with everything unsaid. Sharamph fell asleep first, her breathing evening out into slow, deep rhythms, and Emmett lay awake a long while listening to the sea below the cliffs and thinking, with a kind of wondering disbelief, that he had somehow ended up married to a woman who could kill 6 armed men before breakfast and still smelled faintly of wood smoke and salt when she slept. It was well past midnight when the growl started, low and rough, rising from somewhere deep in Sharamph's chest, and Emmett came fully awake in an instant, heart hammering, certain for one wild moment that they were under attack. But there was no enemy in the room. Only Sharamph, her brow furrowed even in sleep, her hands curling into fists against the blanket, her breath coming ragged and quick, the growl building again in her throat like distant thunder. She was dreaming, and whatever she was dreaming was not kind to her. Emmett had heard stories about orc tempers, about warriors who woke from nightmares swinging blades at whoever stood nearest, and every instinct told him to ease back, to give her space, to protect himself first. He did not move away. Instead, he reached down, slow and careful, and drew the blanket up higher over her shoulder, tucking it gently beneath her chin the way he might have done for anyone he cared for who was cold and frightened and did not know it yet. He did not wake her. He did not flee the bed. He simply lay back down beside her, close enough that his own warmth might reach her through the wool, and murmured, so quietly it was barely more than breath, "I'm here. Whatever it is, I'm here." The growl softened gradually into something quieter, a low, uneven whimper that faded at last into the steady rhythm of true rest. Sharamph's fists unclenched, her furrowed brow smoothed, and Emmett Morgan lay awake a long while after that, watching the ceiling, feeling something settle in his chest that he did not yet have the words for, though he suspected with a strange and terrifying certainty that it might be love. Sharamph woke at first light and lay perfectly still, staring up at the old stone ceiling of the dormitory room, at the cracks in the plaster that had been there since before either of them were born, and tried to understand why her chest ached the way it did. She remembered the dream in fragments, the way she always did. Her father's face, the black and silver banners on the ridge above the stormbound camp, the sound of her clan's tents burning. She had had that dream more nights than she could count in 3 years of running, and always she woke from it alone, tangled in a blanket she had kicked off in her sleep, cold and furious and grieving all over again. This morning the blanket was tucked up to her chin, warm and undisturbed, exactly as it should be for a woman who had slept peacefully through the night. She turned her head slowly and found Emmett already awake beside her, watching her with quiet, careful eyes, not frightened, not wary, only present. "You heard me," she said. "It was not a question." "I did. I growl when the dreams come. Krug says I sound like a bear caught in a trap." She swallowed. "Most men, human or orc, would have moved away, or woken me, or left the bed entirely." "I thought about it," Emmett admitted, "for about half a second. Then I figured you'd had a rough enough night without waking up to find your husband had run off to sleep with the anvils again." He hesitated, then added more gently, "Whatever you were dreaming, it looked like it hurt. I didn't want to make it worse by making you feel like something to be afraid of." Sharamph stared at the ceiling a while longer, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual iron in it. "My father was chieftain of the Stormbound clan. When Vane's men came for our lands 3 years ago, my father refused to kneel. They killed him in front of the whole camp and burned everything we could not carry to make certain no one else would think of refusing. I was hunting in the high pass when it happened. I came back to ash and bodies and a scattering of survivors too frightened to look me in the eye because I had not been there to die with him." Her jaw tightened. "I dream of it most nights, the fire mostly, sometimes his face." Emmett did not offer platitudes, did not tell her it was not her fault or that time would heal it, the things people said when they did not know what else to say. He simply reached over, slow and deliberate, and laced his fingers through hers on top of the blanket. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, but I'm glad you weren't there to die with him too. I'm glad you're here now." Sharamph turned her head to look at him properly, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 years loosened, just slightly, just enough. "You are a strange man, Emmett Morgan," she said softly. "You're not the first person to tell me that. I mean it as the highest compliment I know how to give." And she leaned over, before either of them could think too hard about it, and kissed him, slow this time, unhurried, nothing like the fierce, defiant kiss in the market square, something far more dangerous because it was so much quieter, so much more honest. From that morning on, they did not speak of separate beds again. Life at the Priory grew fuller in the weeks that followed, though never quiet. Sharamph took to helping Emmett in the forge yard, hauling ore and pumping the bellows with a strength that halved his working hours, and in turn he began teaching her the finer points of his craft, how to read the color of heated steel, how to fold and hammer a blade until it held an edge that would not fail in battle. She learned quickly, ferociously, the way she did everything, and more than once Emmett found himself simply watching her work, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sweat gleaming at her collarbone, utterly absorbed in the rhythm of hammer and steel, and thought that he had never in his life seen anything so magnificent. Krug's arm healed slowly, and he took up residence in a small stone outbuilding near the goat pen, grumbling constantly about human cooking but staying nonetheless. A silent, watchful presence who had, by careful degrees, stopped glaring at Emmett quite so hard across the supper table. Word traveled, as word always does in a small coastal province, that the Priory smith had married an orc woman, and Saltmere's reaction was exactly as mixed as Sharamph had predicted. Some of the fishermen who had known Emmett's father and Emmett himself since boyhood treated the marriage with cautious, if uneasy, tolerance, more concerned with getting their nets mended than with who shared the smith's bed. Others were less kind. Sharamph endured muttered insults in the market row, found her coin refused at more than one stall, watched mothers pull their children away from her path as though she carried some contagion. She bore it all with a warrior's stony patience, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of a reaction, though Emmett noticed, in the quiet of the Priory at night, how much it cost her to hold that stillness during the day. It was on a bright, unremarkable market morning, 4 months into their marriage, that Saltmere turned on her entirely, and the whole fragile piece they had built came apart in the space of a single terrible hour. The grain stores near the harbor had burned 3 nights before, a fire that had destroyed half the town's winter reserve and left a dozen families staring down a hungry season. No one had seen who set it. But by the time Emmett and Sharamph walked into the market square that morning to sell a shipment of finished blades, rumor had already done what rumor always does, filled the empty space where truth should have been with the ugliest story available. "There she is," someone shouted, and Sharamph did not need to turn to know the crowd's attention had shifted to her like a flock of gulls scenting blood. "The orc witch. Everyone knows her savage clan's been raiding the hill farms. Now they've burned our grain to starve us out before winter." "That's a lie," Emmett said immediately, stepping forward, but the crowd was already surging closer, and more voices joined the first, ugly and afraid, the way crowds become when fear finds a shape to point at. Vane's men said the Stormbound clan was seen near the granary that night. Send her back to her own kind. We don't want her filth here. Burn for burn, an eye for an eye. Someone threw a rotten turnip. It struck Sharamph's shoulder and she did not flinch, though her jaw tightened and her hand drifted, instinctively, toward the axe at her belt, an act that only inflamed the crowd further. More projectiles followed, stones now, someone's discarded boot, a clay jug that shattered against the cobbles a foot from her leg. The square had gone from market day to mob in the space of a few frightened breaths, 40 or 50 townsfolk pressing closer, faces twisted with a fear that had curdled into something far more dangerous. Emmett Morgan, who had never in his life been the sort of man anyone looked to for leadership, who had spent 6 years content to be simply the quiet smith at the edge of town, stepped directly in front of Sharamph Stormbound and raised both hands, and did not move, even as the crowd's fury broke like a wave against him. "Stop!" His voice cracked across the square, louder than he had known he could shout. "Stop, all of you, and listen to me." The crowd hesitated, some old instinct of respect for the smith who had forged half the blades and tools in every house present still holding barely against the tide of fear. "I have made every knife on your kitchen tables, every plow blade in your fields, every fishing hook half of you carry in your pockets right now," Emmett said, turning slowly to meet as many eyes as he could. "You know me. You've known my family 3 generations. And I am telling you plainly that this woman standing behind me has not left this priory's grounds in the last week except to walk this market with me. She could not have burned your granary, because she was with me every single night, and I will swear that on the memory of my father's grave if you need me to. How do we know you're not just protecting your orc bitch?" Someone shouted from the back, and the ugly word landed like a slap, and Emmett felt something hot and furious rise in his own chest for the first time in this entire confrontation. "Because I am telling you the truth," he said, "and because if any one of you takes one more step toward my wife, you'll be dealing with me first, and I promise you I will not step aside." A stone flew past his ear, close enough that he felt the wind of it. Sharamph moved then, finally, not to flee, not to strike, but to place herself shoulder to shoulder with him, refusing entirely to let him stand as her shield alone. "I did not burn your grain," she said, her voice carrying across the square with the same iron discipline she had once used to command war bands. "I have lost my father, my clan, my home, to men who wear Lord Vane's colors. I know better than any of you what it costs to lose what feeds and shelters you. I would not wish that ruin on this town, whatever any of you think of me." For a moment the square hung in terrible balance, the crowd's fury and the couple's stillness locked against each other like 2 blades pressed edge to edge, and then, from the harbor gate, a new voice cut through the tension, cold and smooth and satisfied in a way that told Emmett instantly this had all been arranged. How touching! Lord Roderick Vane himself sat astride a black horse at the edge of the square, flanked by 6 soldiers in polished mail, his thin face wearing an expression of practiced, aristocratic amusement. A smith defending his savage little bride against the very people whose grain her kinfolk burned to the ground. Truly, love makes fools of even the most sensible men. "Your soldiers set that fire," Sharamph said flatly, no longer surprised, only weary, "to turn this town against me, so you could seize the priory under the pretense of protecting Saltmere from an orc threat you invented yourself." Vane's smile did not falter. "Prove it," he said pleasantly. "Or bow to the will of the people, and come with me now, quietly, and spare this pretty little smithy the trouble of watching his bride dragged away in chains in front of his neighbors." The crowd, uncertain now, torn between their fear and the sudden, undeniable coldness of Vane's arrival, began to murmur among themselves, and Emmett understood with sudden clarity that this had never truly been about grain at all. It had been a trap, laid weeks in advance, waiting for the right spark. You forged the succession papers that gave you Ashcombe Keep, Emmett said loudly, turning to face Vane directly, his heart hammering but his voice steady. Half this town knows old Lord Ashcombe died sudden and strange, and you arrived with a seal nobody had ever seen before claiming his lands 3 days later. You've been looking for an excuse to break the concord and take my wife by force since the day we married, because her protection under that treaty is the one thing standing between you and looking like exactly the tyrant you are. Careful, Smith, Vane said, his smile finally slipping. Slander against a lawful lord is a hanging offense. Then hang me, Emmett said, and did not move an inch, because I'm not stepping aside, and neither is anyone else in this square who's ever bought a blade from my forge and knows I've never lied to them in my life. It was an old fisherman, gray-bearded and stooped, who broke the silence that followed, stepping forward from the crowd with obvious effort. Smith's right, he said gruffly. I've known Emmett Morgan since he was knee-high to his father's anvil. Never known him to lie about anything, not once. If he says his wife didn't burn that grain, I believe him faster than I believe some lord who showed up out of nowhere 3 years back with a fistful of papers nobody can read. A ripple went through the crowd. Another voice, a woman with a basket of mended nets, spoke up. My youngest cut his hand something terrible last spring, and it was the orc woman who bound it up proper while the smith fetched the healer. Never once did she look at him like anything but a scared little boy who needed help. Slowly, unevenly, the crowd's fury began to fracture, doubt creeping in where certainty had stood only moments before, and Vane, sensing the tide turning against him in a way he had not planned for, straightened in his saddle with visible frustration. This changes nothing, he snapped. The Concord's protection does not extend to harboring criminals, if evidence links her clan to the fire. There is no evidence, Sharamph said, because there is no crime of mine to find. But I will tell you what there is evidence of, Lord Vane. There is evidence in every forged deed you have filed since you arrived in this province. There is evidence in every soldier who wears your colors but answers to no crown you can name. I have kept those soldiers' faces in my memory since the day they ambushed me on the coast road, and I will swear before any honest magistrate what I saw and who ordered it. Vane's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Emmett saw real uncertainty cross the man's face, the look of someone realizing his careful plans had just been exposed too far in front of too many witnesses to simply be buried. This is not finished, Vane said, low and cold, and wheeled his horse around sharply, his soldiers falling into formation behind him as he rode from the square, but the retreat did nothing to soften the promise in his voice. This was a man who had just been humiliated in front of the very town he meant to control, and Emmett understood, watching him go, that whatever came next would not be another quiet ambush on a lonely road. The crowd dispersed slowly after that, murmuring, uncertain, some townsfolk still casting wary glances at Sharamph, but the violence had gone out of the square as thoroughly as it had arrived. The old fisherman lingered a moment longer than the rest, nodding once at Emmett, a small gesture that carried more weight than words might have. Sharamph did not speak until they were well clear of the square, walking back up the cliff road toward the priory with Krug hurrying to meet them at the gate, his face thunderous with worry he had clearly been holding since word of the mob reached him. You should not have stood between me and that crowd, she said finally, quietly, once Krug had been reassured and they stood alone in the forge yard beneath the darkening sky. A stone to the skull kills a man just as easily as a soldier's sword, Emmett. I have buried enough people I love. I do not intend to bury you over a lie about grain. Emmett turned to look at her and found, to his own surprise, that his hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, though they had been steady enough in the moment itself. I couldn't have done anything else, he said simply. You're my wife. I don't care what bargain we started with. I wasn't going to stand there and watch a mob hurt you while I did nothing. You could have died. So could you? Every day since you married me, you could have died protecting this forge, protecting me, and you've never once hesitated. He reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it without hesitation. "I'm not asking you to stop being who you are, Sharamph. I'd never ask that. I'm just telling you I'm not built to stand aside either. Not for you." Sharamph stared at him for a long moment, the last of the day's light catching the fierce, complicated emotion in her dark eyes. And then, without warning, she pulled him against her and kissed him with a hunger that had nothing to do with dares or bargains or games at all. Only the raw, aching relief of a woman who had spent 3 years expecting to lose everyone she cared for, and had just watched a man choose, without hesitation, to stand and possibly die for her instead. "I did not expect this," she said against his mouth when they finally broke apart. "Any of it. When I proposed our bargain, I thought only of protection, of a shield against Vane, nothing more." "I didn't expect it either," Emmett admitted, his forehead resting against hers, both of them still breathing hard. "I thought I was agreeing to share a roof with a stranger who terrified me a little and impressed me a lot. I didn't think I'd fall in love with my own wife." Sharamph went very still. "Say that again." "I love you, Sharamph Stormbound." The words came easier than he expected once he had let himself say them once. "I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the night I pulled the blanket up over you and you growled at me in your sleep. And I realized I'd rather face that growl every night for the rest of my life than sleep one more night without you beside me. Maybe it was before that. I just know it's true." Sharamph Stormbound, who had faced down armed soldiers without flinching, who had buried her father with dry eyes because a chieftain's daughter did not weep in front of her clan, felt something break open in her chest at those words, warm and terrifying and entirely unfamiliar. "I love you as well," she said, and her voice was rougher than usual, thick with an emotion she made no effort to hide. "I did not think I had room left in me for it, after everything I lost. But you have made room, Emmett Morgan, whether I intended to let you or not." They stood together in the forge yard a long while after that, wrapped around each other while the sea wind carried the last of the day's light out over the water, and neither of them spoke of Vane again that night, though both knew, in the quiet certainty that settles between two people who have chosen each other completely, that the reckoning was not far off. It came 11 days later, in the dead of night, with fire. Emmett woke to Krug's shout echoing through the priory halls, and the smell of smoke thick enough to sting his eyes even before he was fully out of bed. Sharamph was already moving, already dressed in her leathers and reaching for her axes, her expression carved from the same cold readiness he had seen on the coast road the day they met. "Vane's men," she said grimly, pulling him toward the window. "They mean to burn us out and call it an accident, or claim the fire was set by my own kin sneaking in through the tunnels below the cliff. Either way, they mean this priory in ashes by morning, with us in it if we do not move quickly." Below, in the moonlit forge yard, Emmett could see torches moving through the darkness, a dozen soldiers at least, some already at the outbuildings, others working their way toward the main hall where flames had already caught along the old dry timbers of the west wing. "The forge," Emmett said suddenly. "If that catches, the whole priory goes up in an hour. We have to hold the yard." They fought together that night in a way Emmett had never imagined himself capable of, not as a hero out of some old ballad, but as exactly what he was, a smith who knew every stone and beam of his home better than any invader ever could, using that knowledge like a weapon. He led 2 of Vane's soldiers into the narrow forge corridor, where his own furnace heat became a wall no armored man wanted to press through, while Sharamph took the yard itself, moving between torchlight and shadow with a ferocity that left 3 soldiers on the ground before the others thought better of their orders and began falling back toward the cliff gate. Krug, one arm still weaker than the other from his old wound, held the kitchen door against a fourth with nothing but an iron poker and sheer stubbornness, and it was Krug's shout, cutting through the chaos, that alerted them to the true danger. Lord Vane himself, standing at the edge of the yard with a lit torch in hand, aimed not at the buildings but at the old oil stores near the chapel, close enough to bring the entire east wing down in flame within moments. "Enough of this," Vane snarled when Sharamph turned to face him, axes still dripping, chest heaving. "The Conquered protects your marriage, orc, but it says nothing about a priory that burns down around it by unfortunate accident. Once this is ash, there is no forge rights left to hold and no protection left to hide behind. You would burn an entire holy site, 3 centuries old, over your own wounded pride," Sharamph said, disgust plain in her voice. "Even your own soldiers see what you are, Vane. That is why half of them are lying in this yard instead of fighting for you." "Pride has nothing to do with it," Vane said coldly and moved to throw the torch. Emmett Morgan, who had spent the whole night proving to himself that he was not simply the frightened smith who had once hidden from every larger fight the world offered him, did not think. He simply moved, closing the distance between himself and Vane with the same reckless speed he had shown on the coast road months before, and drove his shoulder into the lord's ribs hard enough to send them both sprawling into the dirt, the torch flying wide and guttering out against the wet stone of the well rim rather than the oil stores. Vane recovered first, scrambling for the dagger at his belt, and it was Sharamph who reached them before the blade could clear its sheath, planting her boot on Vane's wrist with enough force to make him cry out and release the weapon entirely. "It is over," she said, standing above him, axe resting lightly but unmistakably against his throat. "Your soldiers have fled or fallen. Your claim to Ashcombe Keep was already crumbling in the eyes of every honest man in this province after the market square. And now you have been caught, with your own hands, trying to burn a treaty-protected holding to ash rather than honor a bargain you could not break by law." She glanced toward the priory gate, where, in the flickering torchlight, she could see figures approaching from the cliff road, drawn by the smoke and the shouting. The old fishermen from the market, 2 of Saltmere's harbor guards, and behind them, unmistakably, the traveling magistrate who had witnessed their wedding all those months ago, hastily roused from his bed and clearly out of patience for whatever explanation Vane intended to offer. By dawn, Roderick Vane knelt in chains in his own former stable yard, stripped of the black and silver sash that had marked his false lordship, while the magistrate read aloud, in a voice that carried across the assembling crowd, the confession that 2 of Vane's own captured soldiers had given in exchange for leniency. The forged succession papers, the murder of the true Lord Ashcombe dressed up as accident, the burned grain stores set alight by Vane's own men to turn the town against Sharamph and clear the way for seizing the priory. The truth, once it finally surfaced, spread through Saltmere faster than the fire itself had, and the same crowd that had thrown stones in the market square only weeks before now stood in stunned, shame-faced silence outside the priory gates, watching the sun rise over a night that had nearly ended in ash. The fire had scorched the west wing badly, blackened stone and collapsed timber that would take a season or more to rebuild, but the forge itself, and the chapel, and the old dormitory where Sharamph and Emmett had shared a bed and a growing love, stood untouched. Emmett stood in the wreckage of the yard as the sun came up, filthy and exhausted, watching soldiers of the Crown's actual magistrate lead Vane away toward Ashcombe Keep to await formal judgment, and felt Sharamph's hand slip into his. "We won," he said, still faintly disbelieving. "We did." She looked at him, soot streaked across her face, blood from a shallow cut along her jaw, and somehow more beautiful to him in that moment than she had ever been. "Together, Smith, as we should have from the start." The town of Saltmere spent the following weeks in a strange, unsettled quiet, the sort that follows any community forced to confront how close it came to doing something unforgivable. Some folk avoided the priory entirely out of shame. Others came, awkward and stammering, bearing gifts of bread or mended nets or offers of labor to help rebuild the burned wing, as though physical work might scrub away the memory of stones thrown and slurs shouted in the market square. Sharamph, for her part, accepted none of it easily. 3 years of running, of watching doors close and faces turn away, had built walls in her that a few weeks of guilty bread loaves could not simply dismantle. She remained wary through the autumn, courteous but distant with the townsfolk who came calling, saving her true warmth for Emmett, for Krug, for the small, hard-won piece of the rebuilt forge. It was Emmett who first suggested the Harvest Festival, 6 weeks after Vane's fall, when the true heir to Ashcombe Keep, a distant cousin of the murdered lord with a legitimate claim finally restored by the Crown's magistrates, sent word that Saltmere's autumn festival would proceed as tradition demanded, and that the Priory smith and his wife were invited as honored guests, in recognition of what they had exposed and endured. "I do not know if I wish to go," Sharamph admitted, turning the invitation over in her hands in the forge yard, the evening light gilding the newly repaired timbers of the west wing. "Half that town threw stones at me not 2 months past." "I do not know that bread and an invitation undoes that." "It doesn't undo it," Emmett agreed. "Nothing undoes it entirely. But Sharamph, I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've watched it get things wrong plenty of times before you ever arrived. What matters isn't that they got it wrong once. What matters is what they do now that they know better." He took her hand. "I think you deserve to see them try, and I think, whatever happens, I'll be standing right beside you the whole time, same as always." She studied him a long moment, the stubborn set of her jaw softening by degrees, and finally nodded. "Then we will go, together." The morning of the Harvest Festival, Saltmere's market square had been transformed entirely from the last time Sharamph had stood within it, bloodied and surrounded. Banners hung between the stalls, tables groaned under bread and roasted fish and casks of cider. Children ran laughing between the legs of adults who, for once, seemed more interested in celebration than suspicion. The crowd noticed them the moment they passed through the harbor gate, and for one terrible, suspended heartbeat Sharamph felt every old instinct rise in her, the readiness to fight, to flee, to brace against stones that never came. Instead, it was the old fisherman who moved first, stepping forward from the crowd with a wooden cup of cider held out in offering. "Figured you'd want a proper drink, given the last time you stood in this square. We gave you rotten turnips instead," he said, gruff but sincere, and behind him the crowd slowly, awkwardly, began to part and gather closer rather than away. Faces turned toward Sharamph not with fear now but with something far more fragile and far more valuable. An attempt, however clumsy, at making amends. The woman with the mended nets brought her boy forward, the same child Sharamph had once bandaged, now grown a little taller, who looked up at her with open, uncomplicated curiosity rather than his mother's old wariness. "Did you really fight 6 soldiers at once on the cliff road?" he asked, wide-eyed, and Sharamph found herself, despite everything, almost smiling. "4 by the time the smith arrived to make himself useful," she said, and the crowd around them, hearing the exchange, laughed, real laughter, warm and unguarded, and something in the square's whole atmosphere shifted, gentled, opened. Emmett squeezed her hand. "Told you," he murmured. "You did not tell me it would feel like this," she murmured back, watching the boy run off to tell his friends about the orc warrior who had fought an army on the coast road, watching the old fisherman raise his cup toward her in unmistakable salute, watching a town that had once turned on her in fear now turning toward her, however haltingly, in welcome. The festival stretched long into the evening, full of music from a traveling fiddler, dancing in the square, the particular warmth of a community finally exhaling after a long season of fear and false rule. Sharamph danced, badly and without shame, dragged into a circle of laughing townsfolk by the fisherman's daughter, and Emmett watched her from the edge of the square with a fullness in his chest that he thought might simply overflow if he tried to put words to it. Later, when the crowds had thinned and the fires in the square had burned low, they walked home together along the cliff road under a sky thick with stars, the sea murmuring far below, and Sharamph stopped at the top of the path to look back at the lights of Saltmere glowing in the darkness behind them. "I did not think I would ever feel welcome in a human town again," she said quietly. "Not after my father, not after 3 years of running. I had made peace with the idea that I would always be something to be feared or tolerated at best." "And now?" Emmett asked. "Now I think perhaps I was wrong to make peace with it so completely." She turned to face him, moonlight silvering the sharp, strong lines of her face, and reached up to brush her knuckles gently along his jaw, a tenderness that still, months into their marriage, made his breath catch. "I think perhaps some things are worth staying to fight for rather than simply running from. This town, this forge, you. I'm glad you decided to stay," Emmett said. "Every single day I'm glad." That night back in the dormitory room that had become, in every true sense, entirely theirs, Sharamph drew him close beneath the same blanket he had once pulled up over her shoulder while she slept. And there was no fear in the room now, no dream of fire and burning tents waiting to steal her rest. Only the quiet, deepening certainty of two people who had chosen each other through danger, through doubt, through a town's fear and a tyrant's fall, and had come out the other side with something neither of them had ever expected to find. Their intimacy that night held none of the careful hesitance of strangers, none of the charged uncertainty of dares meant to test each other's courage. It was slow and unhurried and entirely without walls, Sharamph's hands finding his with a tenderness that made him ache, Emmett's touch reverent in the way of a craftsman who understood, better than most, the value of something rare and hard-won. When at last they lay tangled together in the dark, her head resting against his chest, his fingers tracing slow, idle patterns along her shoulder, Sharamph spoke into the quiet with a warmth that had nothing guarded left in it at all. "There is a custom among my people," she said softly, "when a warrior chooses a mate for life, not merely for convenience or bargain, she marks him. Not with pain, not truly, only enough to leave proof that he belongs to her, and she to him, before any who might doubt it." "I think Saltmir's already gotten that message," Emmett said, smiling against her hair. "Saltmir is not the one I wish to convince." She lifted her head, meeting his eyes in the dim light, and there was something achingly vulnerable in her expression despite the strength that had never once left her since the day he met her on that bloody cliff road. "I wish to mark you as mine, Emmett Morgan, not because a treaty requires it, not because Vane forced our hand, but because I choose you, freely, entirely, with nothing left in me holding back." "Then do it," he said without hesitation. "I chose you a long time ago, Sharamph. I just didn't have the words for it yet." What followed was neither violent nor frightening, only intimate in a way that felt sacred between them. A small, careful press of her teeth against the curve of his shoulder, gentle enough to leave only a mark rather than a wound, a gesture as old as her people, and as binding in her heart as any vow spoken before a magistrate. Emmett bore it without flinching, and when it was done, Sharamph kissed the mark softly, almost reverently, and settled back into his arms with a contentment that seemed to ease something ancient and long carried in her chest. They slept deeply that night, wrapped together beneath the same blanket, and if Sharamph dreamed at all, it was not of fire, nor of her father's face, nor of burning tents on a distant ridge. When Emmett woke at first light, she was already awake beside him, staring up at the same cracked plaster ceiling that had witnessed the very first morning she realized what he meant to her, and there was no ache in her expression now, no grief clinging to the edges of her thoughts. There was only a quiet, settled peace. "You're staring at the ceiling again," Emmett said softly, brushing a stray lock of dark hair from her face. "I am thinking," Sharamph said, "that for the first time in longer than I can remember, I woke without wanting to be anywhere but exactly here." "Good," Emmett said, pulling her closer, "because I intend to keep you exactly here for a very long time." The seasons turned gently after that. The rebuilt west wing of the priory grew warmer with use. The forge grew busier as word spread along the coast of the smith and his orc wife who had exposed a tyrant and rebuilt a monastery from ash with their own hands. And Saltmir's market square, once the site of stones and slurs, became instead the place where townsfolk greeted Sharamph Stormbound by name, where children asked to see her axes, where the old fisherman never failed to save her the first cup of cider at every festival that followed. Krug eventually took a small cottage of his own near the harbor, close enough to visit often, far enough to grumble about human cooking from a comfortable distance, and became, in his own gruff way, a fixture of Saltmere's life as much as Emmett or Sharamph had. On the anniversary of their wedding, a year to the day since a magistrate had read vows over two strangers bound by bargain rather than affection, Emmett forged a single blade unlike any he had made before, a slender ceremonial dagger with a hilt wrapped in leather dyed the deep, storm-dark blue of the Stormbound clan colors, and presented it to Sharamph in the forge yard beneath a sky just beginning to color with sunset. "For you," he said, "not for protection. You've never needed that from me, just so you'll always have something of your clan's colors clothes wherever we go." Sharamph turned the blade over in her hands, examining the fine, careful work, the balance he had clearly labored over for weeks in secret, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with an emotion she made no attempt to hide. "A year ago," she said, "I offered you a bargain because I needed a shield against a tyrant, and expected nothing more than that from a stranger who happened to be foolish enough to fight for me on a cliff road. And now I think that stranger became the truest thing I have ever known." She set the dagger aside carefully and stepped into his arms, resting her forehead against his. "I love you, Emmett Morgan, not out of bargain, not out of debt, simply because you are exactly the man I choose again and again every single day." "I love you too," Emmett said. "I think I always will." They stood together in the forge yard as the sun set over the ashen sea, the priory's rebuilt walls glowing gold in the fading light, the sound of Saltmere's evening bells drifting up the cliff road on the wind, and neither of them, in that moment, wanted for anything else in the world. The bargain that had begun as two strangers' desperate solution to a tyrant's cruelty had become, through danger and doubt, and the slow, hard-won trust of two people learning to lean on each other, the truest thing either of them had ever built. A home on the edge of the sea, a town that had learned, however painfully, to welcome them both, and a love neither of them had ever expected to find, but which now, wrapped around them like the blanket he had once pulled up over her shoulder in the dark, felt like it had always been waiting for them to find it.